someone's out there listening, and so I'm not just doing this for my family and President Wild, but... So, the CES letter. Why is it worth talking about the CES letter? Well, it's worth talking for two reasons. One, it's specifically something that people are bothered by sometimes, and so that's worth doing. But the CES letter is simply the most recent version of a very old trick, or a very old set of tricks. There's relatively little, that's new in the world of anti-Mormon literature or material critical of the church. Whenever we find something new, it's always a little bit exciting. It's always like, oh, we haven't seen that one before. But 95% of them, it's all been done before. And because it's a new version of an old trick, it's worth thinking about it because it teaches you some broader lessons about how to deal with anything that bothers you about the church or the gospel or things like that. So, let's have a look here. It's an online document, for those of you who don't know what it is. It collects a bunch of criticisms about the church, and those who find it persuasive have done a number of things with it. They've written in Book of Mormon copies in hotel rooms. I'm surprised they have the time, but they've made pass-along cards, just like the church has pass-along cards. They've got their own pass-along cards. I like how that one's right next to the Shasta. I'm not sure what that means. And it went so far as to get snuck into Marvel Comics. The artist who did this was a former member of the church. Marvel made him take it out, but we do have a picture of it there. So we hope Spidey isn't really an anti-Mormon. I don't think he is, but... And you kind of wonder if these people were as enthusiastic at missionary work for the church when they were members as they are for the CES letter. The author of it began asking for money to support him in doing it in 2015, and 5 years later he's still going strong. That's pretty good if he doesn't want to be professional about it. And I have no trouble, obviously, with people saying and believing whatever they want. What troubles me, though, is that they're often not entirely honest about it. This is a quotation from someone who said that I came across the letter when my daughter got an Instagram account, and it was tagged with EFY, seminary, CTR, I love to see the temple, share goodness. So they're trying to, sneak it by you, which isn't terribly honest, I don't think. And some people try to hide what they think and trick people into following along. A former bishop who's now an opponent of the church said, "This makes 2 Sundays in a row that I've secretly placed a full copy of the CES letter in the foyer of my ward building. Both copies have gone by the end of the block. I hope it makes 3 Sundays in a row. Wish me luck. I have to pretend and stay the course because of my true believing Mormon wife. I will not in any way, shape, or form do anything that will cause a divide in our marriage. Except, lie about what you believe, undermine others' beliefs because you can't affect hers. Good luck with that, I guess." And the ads are slick and deceptive. I mean, this looks like, this could be an LDS church ad here, but of course it isn't. But it could have been worse. This is Joseph Smith getting tarred and feathered in 1832, Former members of the church have always caused far more problems for the church than non-members of the church since the beginning, and that continues to be true. Its approach is also not new. People sometimes act as if it's something new and revolutionary, and that it's not. It's the same old story. It's the latest version of an old trick. It's been used many times before, and it'll be used many times in the future. And the approach has a number of terms or labels that have been given to it in discussions of logic or rhetoric or argument. They sometimes call it the laundry list fallacy. It's also called the throw enough mud and see what sticks approach, the million pinpricks, death by 1,000 cuts, or the Gish Gallop. Dwayne Gish is a young earth creationist, and that's how he debates people in evolution, is with a tack similar to this. That's why they call it the Gish Gallop. What is the approach? Well, the approach is simply that you give someone a supposed list of problems, and they overwhelm you with the number of things that are on the list. Because it is always, always, always easier to make an accusation or to ask a question than to answer it. That goes without saying. And the authors of these kinds of lists basically hope that you will think, well, if there are 200 questions, and if even 2% of them are true, then the church has a problem. So they overwhelm you with the sheer number of things, because most people won't know about a lot of them, and certainly very few people will know about all of them. They want to, the goal is to emotionally shock you, lead you to distrust the church and anyone who might speak up in its defense, and to get you to make a fairly abrupt exit and change your whole way of life. And if the author of the CES letter was here, he might very well say, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? Brother Smith, you believe in the church, so of course you think this is an unfair or a deceptive approach to take. And that's true, I probably would, but I'm not the only one who thinks so. I've got some quotes here. This is from a former member of the church. He has since left the church. He's not a believer, but he was raised in LDS culture, and he's now an anthropologist of religion, and he studies specifically the anthropology of the LDS religion, or the Church of Jesus Christ. His name's Mano Padro in Utah. He says this: the CES letter is just accumulated propaganda that has been weaponized to be an effective tool in doubt-bombing Latter-day Saints. Doubt-bombing, he goes on, is an abusive proselyting strategy which has historically been used by Christian missionaries in locations where the local population has a strong tie to another religious tradition. By bombarding the subject with doubt-provoking material, the doubt bomber hopes to cause an identity crisis. This is an artificially induced identity crisis whose sole purpose is to sever the victim's past completely by vilifying and stigmatizing their roots, heritage, and past self. The goal of doubt-bombing efforts is to guarantee that the victim will not return to their old way of seeing the world. The old identity must be so deeply vilified and trivialized that the person cannot hope to return to it. They must be forced to live a half-life where their past is dead to them and their future is all they have left. Clearly, the only appropriate future, and the only one the doubt bombers provides in the future the doubt bomber hoped to corral their victim into, their own. And you see this quite often. You know, people will say, oh, I left the church, and someone will say, why? And, oh, well, if you just read the CES letter, you know, it's this very condescending way of approaching people, of saying, well, if you don't understand it, then you're just a complete idiot, you know. It's a pretty good rule of thumb that anything that millions of people find compelling, be it the church or a political system or what have you, anything that millions of people find compelling probably has something fairly solid to it or something fairly substantial. Treating those things as trivial or as beneath contempt really says more about you than it does about the things that you're talking about. Padro goes on, they want a person to completely give up all healthy relationships with their past faith, heritage, and community. The need of the proselyter is treated as if it were more important than the psychological health of the victim, right? This 65-year-old ex-bishop, I mean, to feel good about himself or to comfort himself for the fact that he's going to a church he no longer believes in, what does he have to do? Well, he has to leave copies of the CES letter lying around. And he doesn't just go up to people and tell them openly what he thinks. He's got this stealth approach. You know, and that's exactly what Padro is talking about here. This reveals the true priorities of the doubt bomber. They're not doing it for the victim's benefit. They're doing it to advance their own particular worldview. And trying to advance your worldview is fine. I mean, I'm trying to advance mine in speaking here. But at least be honest. Be upfront about what you're doing. Don't try to sneak it past me. You know, don't dress the wolf up in this threadbare old sheepskin and, you know, his tongue's hanging out and I can see his teeth and you're, oh, look at the nice sheep. You know, don't pull the other one. Come on, you know. The victim of doubt bombing is just collateral damage, a human sacrifice that must be made for the greater good. This is a sad reality of the anti-Mormon ministry. He says ministry, I mean, traditionally these have been conservative Christian ministries. Nowadays, they're more likely, honestly, to be secular, but they're still ministries in the same way. They still have an ideology and a worldview that they're pushing, and they're trying to get you out of yours into theirs. Honesty, says Padro, ironically, is not their forte. That's an understatement, which is really bizarre considering how much they criticize the church for not being honest. This tactic of intentionally luring Latter-day Saints into a situation, right? That's what that ex-bishop's doing, right? He's not forthrightly sitting down with someone and telling them what he thinks. He's trying to lure them into reading this document, getting doubt-bombed, and then abandoning their faith. He's not being upfront about what he's trying to do. This tactic into a situation where they're bombarded with questions they don't know how to answer is a documented tactic used by these groups. They openly express it. This incredible violation of people's boundaries is done intentionally. They know they can't sell their point of view any other way. When I was a missionary, I went out and I talked to people of many worldviews and religions. And of course, I had things that I had in mind that I would hope they would accept. But I didn't have to go out and try to get them to doubt Catholicism or Islam or secular humanism or disengaged French atheism. I told them what I believed and what I thought. I didn't worry about focusing on their beliefs, They are trying, says Padro, to coerce you into a situation where they can bombard you with so many doubt-provoking questions that they can cause your resolve to collapse and your identity to fall apart. Inside of that vacuum, created by an act of psychological rape, they hope to impregnate you with their own belief system. If that sounds abusive, it's because that's what it is. It's an extension of the cultural legacy of the Inquisition. They can't torture you, but they can humiliate you and pressure you with questions you don't have an answer to yet. They try to hit you up with too many of these questions to answer, because if they don't, it wouldn't work. That's how the CES letter works. It's garbage, but it's a common strategy in the anti-Mormon ministry. When I was a kid, he says, so this is when he was still a member of the church, the Lighthouse Ministry, that was Gerald and Sandra Tanner, and CARM, were the two big groups using this strategy. Now Mormon Stories, that's John DeLynne's anti-Mormon effort, the Life After Ministry, Mormon Think, and a number of other groups are all relying on the same abusive tactic. The internet has made this very easy method or proselyting to abuse. This tactic of online clickbaiting is an excellent example of this, but they have also developed other methods. What's important for you to take away from this, he concludes, is that the history that doubt-bombing critics like the CES letter sold you is inaccurate, and it was deliberately designed to pressure you out of your faith and to vilify you, your family, and your friends for belonging to that faith. In many ways, it is a lie. In others, it is a simple omission of inconvenient facts. In the anti-Mormon narrative, there are a lot of questions that wouldn't have been answerable 50 years ago, that 10 years ago this is Padro again, not a member of the church, assumed had no good answer, that I now know for a fact can be answered now. Close quote. Well, some people will hear that sort of thing and then say to me, well, yeah, but the truth doesn't need a defense. Why is anybody bothering to defend this stuff? If the church is true, it doesn't need anybody to stand up and demonstrate that or argue for it. Truth is its own argument. Well, imagine if you said that when you were accused of murder, and someone said, well, if you're really innocent, you don't really need an attorney, you don't really need a lawyer, you don't need anyone to stand up in court and tell your side of it. You don't need anyone to do that. The truth will cut its own way. If you believe that, I beg you, please don't say anything to the police until your lawyer gets to the jail, because you will find that you do need an advocate. You do need someone to speak in your favor. Jeffrey R. Holland said, I thought it a marvelous understatement when someone said, there will be times when our faith will require an explicit defense. And Elder Maxwell said, there will be a convergence of discoveries, never enough, mind you, to remove the need for faith, to make plain and plausible what the modern prophets have been saying all along. I do not expect incontrovertible proof to come in this way, but neither will the church be outdone by hostile or pseudo-scholars. So, in that spirit, let's have a look at the first example here. Now, there are many examples in the CES letter. Some of the things they talk about, we've talked about or will talk about in others of these sessions. I've just picked a few here, partly because they're fun, and partly because they don't really fit in a lot of those others. I didn't do all this research myself. One of my friends did a lot of it, but he told me I could steal it, and I put footnotes, so that makes it research. So anyway, we'll just see how this goes. So, the author of the CES letter knows that these are kind of bogus. This is a statement here where he talks about how he's 90 to 95% convinced he's going to remove this section. He wants to put a disclaimer in it, maybe saying they're controversial, it's not incorrect, but it's not strong. Here's resources. And when some friends of mine did some stuff pointing out all the problems with this list. Then he updated the list and thinks he's got it cleaned up by now. Well, he hasn't. So he kept it because people put up a big hue and cry. His fans put up a hue and cry when they were going to take it out. Again, it doesn't matter how good the argument is. It's just the point is that should be a lot of arguments. That's how this works. So the more you have, the better. So Hawley, this guy Hawley from, I think back in the 80s, he came up with 28 place names, which he claimed that Joseph got from the surrounding 300 to 400 miles from his home. I mean, I don't know how well you know little towns that far from your home, but I guarantee you Joseph knew them far less. But anyway, he came up with this list. The CES letter took out 8 of them, that's 29%, because they were clearly bogus, didn't work. And yet we're supposed to trust the rest of the list that's left. And so on this list of 20% of 20 names, even if it was completely true, you would only have explained 23% of the Book of Mormon's 86 place names. So it doesn't prove as much as you might think. But remember, this is all about death by 1,000 cuts. The more criticisms you have, the better the list looks. And so it seems this has stayed. So let's look at the 20 remaining names that the CES letter thinks are worth including as gotchas for Joseph Smith. So this is Hawley's supposed map of how the Book of Mormon geography works. I mean, I think he's smoking crack. The text says nothing like this at all. That could be a long discussion. But anyway, he's convinced that's the Book of Mormon map. And so here's Joseph's environment, and here's his map. And so you can see the various, just to pick an example, you got Morianton there above the Sea West. What is that, Lake Erie, I think? And then here you got Moravia Town. Yeah, it is Lake Erie. What do you know? Junior high school social paid off. And so supposedly Joseph got Morianton from Moravian Town, and so on. So here's the 20 places, and we're going to go through them. So in the first place, there's Alma, which he claims there's a Valley of Alma. Well, in fact, there are a couple of Almas, 3 of them, in fact. There's one in West Virginia, one in Ohio, and one in New York. And Joseph was in New York at the time. There's a slight problem with this because it really makes a difference because they're all over the map. So if Hawley's trying to correlate this with the map, it doesn't really work. But anyway, leaving that aside, they didn't exist in 1830. So these wonderful examples that are supposedly smoking guns, these cities of Alma didn't even exist in 1830. So they weren't available for Joseph to use, even if he had wanted to. The West Virginia one was called Ripley until 1884. The one in Ohio was not founded until 1869, and the one in New York, 1833, 4 years after the Book of Mormon was published. So Joseph Smith apparently time traveled, took the name from a woman, Alma, and then applied it to a man. The Book of Mormon makes him a man, but that was not a male name in Joseph's time and place. But it is an ancient Israelite name, not found in the Bible. As it can be seen, one author wrote, critics have had a lot of fun with the name Alma. Back when Joseph first published the Book of Mormon, a lot of critics were like, "Oh, he's so stupid. He made Alma a man's name." Well, you got to be careful what you make fun of, because in the 1960s, an Israeli archaeologist discovered a land deed near the Dead Sea dating to the early 2nd century after Christ, and rendered the name of a Jew as Alma ben Yehuda, showing for the first time in modern history that the name Alma was an authentic Hebrew male name. Additional research in Ebla, in what is modern Syria, has turned up this name going all the way back to nearly 2200 BC. So, lucky boy, that Joseph Smith. So, Alma is right out. I put 2 red lines through it because it didn't exist. It wasn't there for Joseph to pick. Okay, next there's a supposed city, Antioch, which Joseph supposedly turned into Anianti. That's a bit of a stretch, kind of weak, but it didn't exist until 1837. So it gets an X. Boaz, well, that didn't exist until 1878, but it's also a Bible name. I mean, if Joseph's looking to steal stuff, why does he have to pick these cities that didn't exist in his time? Wouldn't it be easier just to pull it out of the Bible? Jerusalem, Ohio. Where on earth could Joseph have come up with Jerusalem? In any case, it wasn't a town until 1893. The CES letter says, no, but it was settled in 1825. But it had one house in 1825, and it got a second house in 1838. So Joseph supposedly knows about a single house 395 miles away from he lives, hears that it's called Jerusalem, which I doubt at the time, and then picks it. Right. And it's also a Bible name, as it should be obvious, I hope. If Joseph's cheating, isn't that easier? There's Shiloh, Pennsylvania. It wasn't named that until 1907. Shalom is the word that it's supposedly borrowed from, and that means peace in Hebrew, and it's in the Bible anyway. So again, if you're looking for Joseph copying the Bible, it makes more sense. Noah Lakes, this is supposedly the land of Noah. Again, didn't exist. That's a modern reservoir. It was made by a big dam that was built there, not built in Joseph's day, and it was 315 miles from where he lived. And Noah is also somewhere to be found in the Bible if you look real close. There's also Sodom, Ohio. Well, that also didn't exist in Joseph's day, and again, Sodom is well known in the Bible. And the Sidon, what they try to get Sidon, is probably referring to the city of Sidon on the coast of Israel. But again, it's in the Bible and more plausible. Then there's Ripple Lake, Ontario, which Joseph supposedly turned into Ripley-Ancum. Well, this one did exist in Joseph's day, so we finally have something that's at least theoretically possible. But it was 324 miles away from his home. And it was a lake that measured 700 meters by 200 meters. Can you name a lake that small, 300 miles from here? I doubt it. But we'll put a little circle around that one because it's at least theoretically possible. Jacobsburg, Ohio, 373 miles from Joseph. It was a postal stop. And by 1833, it had a post office and a tavern and a store. And Jacob, again, you can find that in the Bible. They're really stretching here. Why does Joseph have to get all these places, tiny, tiny places? You know, why isn't he picking any of the big places? How does he know about these spots? Sherbrooke, Quebec. It was called Hyatt's Mill, and it became Sherbrooke in 1818, but again, 408 miles away. And this is supposed to be equal to Shur, so Sherbrooke, Shur, that's a stretch. Kishkementas, Pennsylvania. Again, a post office stop in 1826. It was 320 miles from Joseph's home. It was made a town in 1876. But, you know, maybe the poverty-stricken Joseph Smith's family was always mailing letters to these obscure places. I don't know. Mantua, Ohio, supposedly Manti. This is another post office stop. It became a town only in 1898. It's 280 miles away. Ramah, another post office stop. Maybe Joseph collected stamps. Maybe that's how he knew all this. 267 miles. So let's just pause here and take stock. Of the 28 options, 8 of them even the CES letter cut out because they made the rest look silly. So think how bad they must have been not to have made the cut. Of the 20 left, 2 of them didn't exist at all at that time. 6 didn't exist, but had Bible names that could have been used. 4 did exist, but were tiny outposts between 267 and 408 miles from where Joseph was. So we're down to only 8 left, which is only 29%. But you notice how the tactic of let's throw a lot of the mud works. The map, it's got a big pretty map, it's a big impressive list, this is intimidating and serious. And the author assures us how fair he's being because he's taken out the less plausible ones, though that disguises how bad the whole idea was to begin with. And tracking all this down was not easy. I kind of worked on the side a little bit with my friend when he was doing it, but it took some time, even today, with the internet and everything. So imagine if this came out in 1980 or 1985. How would you deal with it? You know, how would you answer these questions? It looks laughable when you set it all out, but to get there takes a lot of work. And the idea is that if you throw dozens or hundreds of these sorts of things at somebody, nobody has time to do all the work, especially when you're berating them or making them feel stupid or deceived or gullible or tricked by the church. Moving on. Jordan. Well, finally we've got something that match. 47 miles away. It didn't become a town until 1835, but it did exist in Joseph's day. But it was also a Bible name. Again, why does he have to resort to these? Lehigh, Pennsylvania, for Lehi. Sure, why not? Was a pound, but again, also a Bible name. Helam, Pennsylvania. This is not in the Bible. This is, for me, the first one that is even close to a hit that's not in the Bible. Again, it was a town, but it was more than 270 miles away. Antrim, Pennsylvania, again, 127 miles. Moravian Town, Ontario. It was an Indian reserve that was 281 miles away from Morianton. Oneida. This is a nice thing. He has Oneida twice, as if the two names, it's the same name. You don't get to count it twice. Maybe it's more impressive to say 20 items instead of 19. Adding that extra 20 makes it seem bigger. Maybe that's why. I don't know why you picked the same name twice, but he did. So let's change the 20 to a 19 because there's only 19 there. 8 were eliminated even by the CES level. 1 was a duplicate. Of the 19 left, 2 didn't exist. 6 didn't exist but have Bible names. 4 existed but were tiny. We're down to 7. And of those 7 left, 2 of them are biblical. Oneida and Jordan are less than 100 miles away, and these others are less than 300 miles away. Now, on the non-biblical ones, only 3 of them strike me as at all plausible connections. So let's give him all of them. Let's give him all of them, everyone that's not in the Bible. That's 5. So great, you've just explained 5.6% of Joseph's names. Now you can start on the people. There's about 300 of those. So let's just stop again for a second. Is this supposed map and the supposed parallels, is this good evidence against the Book of Mormon? I think most fair-minded people would say no, that's absurd. It's reaching, it's completely implausible. It would be far more, you don't have to believe Joseph was translating an ancient record. If he's going to come up with those names, far better to just flip open his Bible and pick them. Like Jerusalem, good grief. You don't need some hamlet, miles and miles away to come up with the name Jerusalem. And even the CES letter admits this, but it can't quite bring itself to remove them from the list, because the more things that are on the laundry list, the better this tactic works. And this one has pretty maps to look at, which makes it more convincing to someone who's overwhelmed. There's interesting research on this. They've done studies where they take an article and they write it about the brain. And they make 2 copies of that article. One article, they just give you the article. The other article, they give you the same article, but they put a CT scan picture up at the top of it. So a brain scan. Which one do you think readers find more convincing? The one with the brain scan picture. Never mind that the brain scan picture has nothing to do with what's in the article. And never mind that the reader couldn't read the brain scan image even if they wanted to. Having an image makes things more compelling. That's just how we are as humans. So should all that shake your faith? Well, no, it shouldn't. If it did, you need to give your head a shake, Like there might be good reasons to leave the church, but that is not one of them. So now ask yourself this question. Should 100 questions of that level of argument weigh against your faith? And the answer to that should be no. 100 weak or inadequate arguments don't suddenly magically add up to convincing evidence. There's an old computer expression, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. You put lousy data in, you're going to get lousy data out. And it doesn't matter if you put a whole lot of lousy data, it's still lousy. You have to evaluate each argument on its merits. You don't get to pile a whole bunch of bad ones together and say, well, each of these is really weak, but if you add them all up, then they become strong. That's not how evidence works. So don't let them blind you with the volume of lousy arguments. Don't buy into the doubt bombing. But all that takes time, and it takes patience, and it requires mastering a lot of material, and it requires research skills that not everybody has. And people who are shocked or scared or feeling betrayed when they get this whole list thrown at them are not usually in the best place mentally to take a deep breath and to put in all the hours of work that it would take to answer those questions, if they want legitimate answers. The CES letters and all the other list-type criticisms against the church count on that fact for their success. So don't be fooled. Once you know how the magic trick is done, it's not so impressive. Number 2, the late war. So this is, like I said earlier, when we find a new anti-Mormon attack, that's kind of exciting. It's sort of like discovering a new kind of mammal, It's something that doesn't happen every day. Most anti-Mormon attacks have been around for decades, most before the beginning of the 20th century. But this is actually new. And the CES Letter didn't invent it, but they probably did more to popularize it than anyone else. So what does it claim? Well, they claim that Joseph Smith stole or copied part of the Book of Mormon text from another book. There have been several books over the years that people have claimed that the Book of Mormon used as sources. Reading those books is usually all it takes to prove that that's nonsense. The church even published some of them through BYU because they were hard to find. So the church just up and published them so people could read them and say, yeah, that argument is nonsense. I have read them, and that argument is nonsense. That's 2 hours of my life I'll never get back. But every time this sort of thing happens, everybody says, we've finally figured out how Joseph did it. We've finally solved the puzzle. And so it turns out to be here. The late war is about the War of 1812, which proud Canadians will remember as the time when Canada beat the U.S. in a war and burned down the White House. Proud day for us all. It was a book written for school children. It's written in a kind of a false biblical King James Bible style of English, so that kind of matches the Book of Mormon. And it was written in 1819, so it was early enough that Joseph could have seen it and could have copied from it. So let's not forget some things. So when you're confronted with something like that, the first thing you should remember is, now wait a minute, I have to put this in with all the other evidence I know. As we've talked about the translation of the Book of Mormon, you have to remember that all the eyewitnesses talked about him doing it in a certain way, about putting the seer stone or the Urim and Thummim in a hat and putting the hat over his eyes. And they all, anyone who said anything about manuscripts, made it very clear that Joseph didn't have any books and he didn't have any manuscripts and he didn't have anything to cheat off of. And the CES letter, ironically, makes a big deal about Joseph translating with his face in the hat. But if that's true, then how the heck is he supposed to put his notes with the late war into the hat and read them? Does he have a candle in there? What's he doing? There's no LEDs, there's no iPods. Fire is the only way to light the inside of your hat. So the CES letter's arguments aren't even internally consistent, right? If we're going to accept the late war argument, then we shouldn't really accept what it says about seer stones and vice versa. But again, it doesn't matter. It's not trying to create a coherent narrative here. It's just trying to present you with as many reasons for doubt as it can. Okay, so before we even get into the actual claim, our suspicion should be up. We should be saying, now wait a minute, I don't know anything about this late war book, but I do know something about how the Book of Mormon was said to be translated. And that doesn't quite work, unless Joseph's memorizing the late war and then spitting it back later. So, and remember, the late war is not about religion, and the plot is entirely different. So Joseph isn't getting much of the Book of Mormon from it. The characters are different, and the Book of Mormon doesn't have anything about, burning down the White House or anything like that. But the critics say Joseph has stolen some of his language from it. So he's not using the book as a source for plot or characters or ideas, but he's copying language. He's taking exact words from the late war and he's using them in the Book of Mormon. Okay, so let's look at some examples. Example number 1. Both books talk about an iron rod. You all know the Book of Mormon story, Lehi's dream, hold to the rod, all that sort of stuff. What does the late war say? It says, we will rule them with a rod of iron, close quote. That's it. That's the whole theft. That's what Joseph has. So rod of iron, basically, is what Joseph has supposedly stolen from the late war. Well, come on. The CES letter doesn't seem to be aware of this fact, but rule them with a rod of iron is in the Bible. It's in the book of Revelations. So it's not even from the late war. It's from the Bible. As you would know if you Googled the phrase. It's the first thing that comes up. So that's not super impressive. Like, really? Joseph has to copy that out of some kid's book written in 1819? Example number 2. The late war describes objects partly of brass and partly of iron, and were cunningly contrived with curious works, like unto a clock, and as it were a large ball. So again, the thing that's supposedly stolen here is this ball of curious, that means intricate or mechanically skilled or crafted construction. Not much of plagiarism. And this is a torpedo. Not really much to do with the Urim and Thummim, though I guess if you see a torpedo up close, you'll know where you're going. It won't be the promised land. So again, this sounds terrible, right? We've got the actual language that Joseph's stolen from this book. But then when you crack the book open and you look at the examples, it's like rod of iron, curious ball. Like, really? That's all you got? It would be easier just to make that stuff up. This is my favorite. The first book of Napoleon. So, okay, maybe you didn't buy what we're saying with the late war, but now we got the first book of Napoleon. This was published in an academic journal. I mean, they went all out on this one. In this book, Joseph stole actual wording, supposedly. He took actual text from this book and stuck it in the Book of Mormon. Now, if that was true, that would be impressive, or that would be concerning, We've got him now. So a common approach in this sort of attack, and this has been done with the Book of Mormon, it's been done in many other analyses of literature and stuff, and the consensus is this is a terrible way to do things because it picks out parallels, but it makes things look more close than they really are. So it's not really a very sophisticated technique, but it can be a convincing one. So on the left, first book of Napoleon, you will see the wording that is from the book. So this is quoted from the book. Condemn not the writing and account, the first book of Napoleon, upon the face of the earth, it came to pass, the land, their inheritances, their gold and silver, and the commandment, etc., etc., etc. And if you compare that to the Book of Mormon, you will find, oh my goodness, it's almost identical. Condemn not the writing, one after another. It's an exact match, Batman. This can't have happened by chance, can it? This is clearly forgery or copying, right? Well, if you think that, you have not been paying attention. Stay with us. First off, and this is Brother Smith's lesson number 1 to reading anti-Mormon literature. Well, rule 1 is don't, but rule 2 is if you must, look for the ellipsis. So ellipsis is a fancy word. It's for the 3 little dots. You see one right here. And you put those in scholarly works. That indicates that there's text between the text that I've cited that I've taken out. So those dots represent omitted text. And this is a very legitimate thing to do. You don't always need to quote an entire paragraph or an entire phrase. Sometimes you just need bits to make the point you're making, and it saves space and it's easier on the reader. So ellipses in themselves aren't bad. But whenever you see an ellipsis in a quote in an anti-Mormon book, the first thing you should do is go look that quote up. And if you look here, there's a lot of them. There's another one. There's another one. Anyway, there's a ton of them. Okay, so what that tells us is that there is a lot of text that has been trimmed out in this quote. This quote might be absolutely 100% accurate, but there's a lot in there that we're not being shown. Now, that might be legit or that might be illegit. But again, in my experience, if you're reading an anti-Mormon book, the first thing you ought to do is you ought to go check those sources. As soon as I see an ellipse, I start rubbing my hands together because I know that good stuff, I'm going to find good stuff. I can't tell you how many times I've found things hidden that way. I mean, I won't say it's always the case, but I would bet almost that it's more often than not. More often than not, there's something there the author doesn't want you to see or hopes you don't know about. So where is the Book of Mormon material from? Let's look at that. Well, here we've split it out. So in red there, you've got the list of where this stuff all came from. So there's 53 words here, and they come out of the title page and the whole first 3 chapters of the Book of Mormon. So title page, then 1 Nephi, then 1 Nephi 11, 1 Nephi 5. Oh, wait a minute, that isn't in order. Then 1 Nephi 2:11, so now we've jumped a whole chapter ahead. Now 1 Nephi 2:11, now 1 Nephi 2:10, so we're actually going backwards again. Then we're jumping ahead to 2:11 again. Now we're going to 2:16, then 2:13, and now we're jumping all the way to 3:17. So these things really aren't in order, and they're jumping all over the place. They're huge gaps. I've pointed those out to you. Okay, another one here. That's not in order. 2:16, then you go to 2:13, and now to 2:17. 3:17, sorry. So This is 1.9% of the text. This is the original Book of Mormon, so this is the 1830 edition, the first one Joseph Smith published. So in the upper left corner there, you can see that's the title page, and I've highlighted in blue all the words that they've quoted here. So look at that. Look at those huge gaps. I'll put circles around them so you can see them. Look at all that text in there. This one here, does it light up? Maybe it doesn't light up for me. Anyway, the between the second to last and the last one's my favorite. Like, look at that, like almost 2 pages of text, unsighted. Let's see. There we go. And remember, they have to put some of them out of order for even this to work. Now, I've done the same thing here with, my friend did this one, I did the previous one. This is the Book of Napoleon. This is the first 25 pages. And the dots are where their text is from, this text that supposedly matches. Well, this is worse than the Book of Mormon, right? Look at that. You've got it scattered all over 25 pages. There's pages and pages between some of them. Now, can anyone out there with a straight face believe this? No one writes that way, even plagiarists. Can you imagine Joseph or anybody else doing that? What's he saying? He's a little snippet here and there. It's like, gee, I'm stuck for a word, not an idea, not a character, not a plot development, not a concept. I'm stuck for a word. Maybe I'll just jump a few hundred words ahead in this book and then I'll copy that. Nobody writes that way. And the CES Letter author, again, I think, kind of tips his hand and lets us know that he knows that this is kind of shady. He says this: "The following is a side-by-side comparison of selected phrases the Book of Mormon is known for from the beginning portion of the Book of Mormon with the same order in the beginning portion of the first book of Napoleon. Note, these are not direct paragraphs." It's like the, it's like the disclaimer on all the drug ads, right? This will cure your heartburn, may cause rectal bleeding, it's that sort of thing. With the same order. Well, no, they aren't. They're not the same order. And these aren't direct paragraphs. Yeah, no kidding, they're not direct paragraphs. They're not even on the same page, some of them. So the reason that this attack is new is that coming up with something like this, silly as it is, would be pretty much impossible without a computer. Nobody writes like that. Nobody plagiarizes like this, especially in Joseph's era. But you can find false patterns using short snippets of text if you compare two works that are long enough. But it takes a computer to do it. It can look impressive until you know how the trick is done. And if you want to know my guess, I think they took the Book of Mormon text and a bunch of 19th century texts and just turned the computer loose until they found one that kind of matched. That's my guess, is how they did this. I very much doubt that anybody was reading the first book of Napoleon and they said, oh my gosh, this is just like the Book of Mormon. No, they turned their computer loose on probably hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of texts, and law of averages, if you do that enough, you're going to find some hits. But even with this, they really had to work at it. They had to flip stuff around, and it's really not in the order they claim it is. So, and at the end of the day, let's say Joseph did do that, even though it makes no sense. Where did he get the other 98% of the text? You haven't explained anything, You've just made his job harder, if anything. So, only cheesy amateurs do stuff like this, right? It's only guys who have nothing better to do that post PDFs online on their blog that do this sort of thing, right? Well, I wish that was true. But these types of techniques, when used to attack the church or its doctrines, or to challenge the church and its doctrines, are distressingly common, even, I'm sorry to say, in academic work. Authors often rely on the fact that their readers trust them. That's why we're reading the book. If we didn't trust the author of a book or an article, then we wouldn't read it in the first place. So authors there's an implied trust that's between us. And that trust can be heightened if they seem to be very scholarly, if they seem to follow all the rules and put in their ellipses and put little footnotes and with references, and we think, well, surely they wouldn't out and out lie to me, would they? Surely they wouldn't. They might be mistaken, but surely their heart's in the right place. Well, maybe. But they trust, or they count on the fact that their readers are by and large not going to check the footnotes. Most of us, when we pick up a book, most of the time, we don't check every footnote. When I read books like this, I do, because I know what I'm going to find. But it takes a long time, and it's tedious. So this is a recent example that I just ran onto. It will be published sometime soon, after the poor source checkers have to check my 578 footnotes in the paper. So I've been reading this book that I have published, or I've submitted a review on. It is not a fly-by-night sort of book. It is not published by a nobody. It is published by an academic university press in 2020, I think. The author is a tenured professor at a major university. The author is the editor at the present of a journal that publishes about church topics regularly. So this is someone who's known in the field, he's tenured, he's respected, he's publishing with a respectable press. You should be able to trust this. Other academic experts have praised the book, unwisely, I will argue, in my review. And so it must be on the level, right? Well, let me give you just one example out of this book. Like I said, I came up with about 578 footnotes, so there's lots of these. But this is a simple one, it's an easy one to understand, and I think it's pretty indisputable. This is what the book claims that President Spencer W. Kimball said about homosexual acts. Kimball noted that homosexuality and bestiality both were deserving of the death penalty, and that regrettably, that's the author's quotes, he's quoting President Kimball, regrettably, close quote, quote, the law is less severe now, close quote, as was the community's attitude. Well, that's an explosive little bit there, right? So you have President Kimball saying that it's too bad that the law doesn't let us kill people who have gay sex. They deserve it, right? Homosexuality and bestiality both were deserving of the death penalty, he says. Just like bestiality, having sex with animals. That's pretty bad, right? What a homophobe, right? So if you read that in a book, you might be quite disturbed, troubled. Well, let's check the source. So here's the book, President Kimball's Miracle of Forgiveness, page 79. This is what he says. All deviations from normal, proper heterosexual relationships are not merely unnatural, but wrong in the sight of God. Like adultery, incest, and bestiality, they carried the death penalty under the Mosaic law. There's nothing there at all that says they deserve the death penalty. All he says is they're wrong in the sight of God. That's hardly controversial. And he uses the fact that they were considered sinful under Mosaic law. That's how he's trying to demonstrate that it's sinful. He's saying, yes, these are sins. They were sins because even to the point that the Mosaic law said you had to be put to death. Quite different from what the author has told us he said. But he quoted him, right? Remember, he quoted, let's just go back here. He quoted him, regrettably, the law is less severe now. Okay, so according to this author, President Kimball thinks it's too bad that the law doesn't let us kill people who have gay sex. Okay, let's see what President Kimball actually said. President Kimball actually, in the book, said this: the law is less severe now than the Mosaic law, and so, regrettably, is the community's attitude to these grave sins. Wait a minute. That's totally different. He doesn't say it's regrettable that the law is more severe. He says it's regrettable that people's attitude has led to believing these aren't serious sins. So you have to work hard to mislead your audience this badly. So at the top here, I've got what President Kimball said. The law is less severe now, and so regrettably is the community's attitude to these grave sins. The improved version that our author gives us is below. Regrettably, let's pull that over there, the law is less severe now, as was the community's attitude, which he doesn't put in quotes, which he should, because it's a quote from President Kimball. So, having seen that, would you trust this author's use of his sources without checking them? You shouldn't, because he has betrayed our trust here. Everything he said, in a sense, is true here. The word regrettably, yes, that's in quotes, and that is from President Kimball. The law is less severe now. Yup, President Kimball said that. But he switched the order. It would have been far easier if he really wanted to show what President Kimball said to just quote the sentence. But instead he puts quote, open quote, regrettably, close quote, then a news thing, open quote. That kind of shady. You have to work that hard to be that misleading. And he isn't, and to point out finally, and President Kimball isn't just talking about homosexuality and bestiality. You know, we're supposed to be shocked by that President Kimball is lumping these things together. President Kimball also mentioned the same penalty for incest and adultery. He's talking about all sexual sins as it being unfortunate that our attitudes are regarding them as less severe. He isn't singling out same-sex sins as uniquely terrible, deserving of death. He nowhere says they deserve death. He says they were punished by death under the Mosaic Law, and that's how we know they were sins. President Kimball also says this: although Israel's swift and severe punishment, which was death, incidentally, for infractions of the Sabbath is not exacted today, this does not lessen the seriousness of the offense to the Lord for violating his day. So President Kimball's saying, even though we don't, the law doesn't require people to be put to death for violating the Sabbath, that doesn't mean that it's not a sin. Newsflash, President Kimball wants Sunday shoppers put to death. Film at 11. Makes no sense. So there's quite a difference between someone saying those who commit homosexual acts deserve to be killed, just like people who have sex with animals, and it's too bad we can't do that anymore, versus what he actually says: homosexual acts are sinful, just like other sexual acts that have been forbidden, and always have been, and it's too bad that society doesn't agree anymore. So the same kind of approach. So when you see those ellipses, when you see the quotes, if it doesn't sound right, if it doesn't smell right, check the sources. So what's our take home here? Well, asking questions is easier than answering them, always. Lots of bad arguments don't add up to one good argument. There are answers to sincere questions about church history, scripture, and doctrine. We've seen some of those. We've talked about some in other times we've spoken together. And if there's things in the CES letter or anywhere else that you want to review or go over, just let President Wild know and we'll deal with them. I haven't intentionally avoided any argument in the CES letter because I don't think there's an answer or I don't think it can be dealt with. There's a lot of them and we don't have all that much time. So if there's questions you think should be treated here, let's treat them. Those answers will never and should never dispense with the need for faith. No one's ever going to be able to prove to you that Jesus was resurrected in 33 AD 33. No one's ever going to be able to prove to you that Joseph Smith saw the Father and the Son in the Sacred Grove. No one's ever going to be able to prove to you that the Book of Mormon is an ancient text. But all of those and many other claims can be defended, and any attack on them is not going to be definitive either. There's nothing that the critics can throw at you or the church or the gospel that doesn't leave room for belief and for faith and for trust and in God. And only revelation can ultimately build spiritual strength. What I've done here, we've shown you some of the logical problems with these arguments. We've had a bit of fun with it maybe, but that's not grown your testimony, I don't think, or it probably shouldn't much, It's at best, it's cleared some of the weeds out. It's said those things are not reasons to toss your testimony and go home. Only revelation can do that. So these kinds of discussions, they're a place to start. They are not a place to end. These things don't matter in the least. Like that stupid little map of Hawley's made back in the 1980s, it doesn't matter if anybody in the church knows about that. It makes no difference. The only time it matters is if that becomes one of the reasons that people decide to throw their testimony away or to quit praying or to quit reading their scriptures or to quit keeping their covenants. Then it matters a whole lot. So only revelation can deal with these sorts of things. Bad arguments shouldn't destroy our faith in God. You will also find sometimes as you read and learn about these things that some of what you've thought's been incorrect, and that's okay. We're all learning. If you read a book and you don't learn anything new and you don't change your opinion or your view about something, then you probably wasted your time reading that book. It either wasn't worth reading or you weren't paying attention, and you should have changed your opinion about something. That's a normal part of life. That's a normal part of living. It's a normal part of becoming an adult and how we function in the church. So don't be afraid of changing your mind. Don't be afraid of changing how you see things. And don't think that just because you have to change how you've seen something, that means there's something wrong with the church or the gospel. It just means the way you've understood something isn't the best way to understand it. Those who use these tactics, I hope you can see, are not always being intellectually honest, and they don't always have your best interests at heart. They have an ideological agenda, which they often do their best to disguise. It's not intellectually honest, I'm sorry to say, to swap President Kimball's words around like that to make him say something he didn't. Maybe it was an accident, I don't know. Maybe it was well-intentioned, I don't know. But it makes you worry. And lastly, don't assume that something that looks scholarly and looks rigorous is accurate. Just because I have my footnotes and I've got it nicely formatted and I'm published by a snazzy press doesn't, unfortunately, necessarily mean that it's right. President Wild could tell you that too. There's lots of stuff that gets published in medical journals that just ain't right, just ain't so. That's a place to start, but that's where you start your thinking. It's not where you don't check your brain. I don't turn my brain over to the New England Journal of Medicine and just say, well, they said it, it must be true. No, that's where you start. And lastly, check the sources. Check the sources. That's what it all goes back to. I hope this has been useful. I hope it's been a bit fun. The church is true. I have found that my testimony grows and my confidence in Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon grows as I confront these sorts of things. It's not easy to do these things. Not everybody needs to. Not everybody should. But if you're interested in them or troubled by them, don't let that stop you. Don't be afraid of it. There's nothing to be afraid of if you're willing to put in the time and the work and the energy and the mental effort and the attention to detail that they recall. It took my friend a long time to find all those place names. If he'd just thrown up his hands, well, he might have had concerns. But once he tracked them all down, he wasn't worried. If anything, he had a good laugh. When I first read that phrase from President Kimball, or supposed phrase, I remember thinking, that's odd. I've read a lot of President Kimball, and I don't ever remember him saying that. And it took me a long time to check the source, because, there it was in quotation marks. It was footnoted. I thought, oh, well, I must have totally missed that. But as one thing led to another, I looked it up, and then I thought, I see what's going on here. So these things will build and can build faith and testimony, but that takes time. You have to be patient. You have to wait on the Lord. It takes time to find references. It takes time to find things. I have things and questions that I always have at the back of my mind, things that I haven't totally figured out yet, or that I'm not totally happy with, or that I've heard about, and they're always there. And sometimes I'm not looking for answers to them. Because if I knew where to find the answers, I would have gone and looked and found them and been done with it. But they're in the back of my mind. And then as I read and I study and I reflect, I'll run on to things that answer those questions. But I wouldn't have found the answers if I had stopped looking, and I wouldn't have known to recognize the answers if I didn't have the questions first. So that's an important part, I think, of spiritual maturity. It's how you solve any sort of problem. Lots of people who talk about problems in business or science or mathematics will talk about how, they have these problems in their mind and they will suddenly stumble on the solution all of a sudden. What's gone on is that they have prepared themselves to recognize the answers when they find them. Finding the answer is often a sudden, simple, very lucky, or looks like luck, probably isn't, coincidence, which is probably not coincidence, but it's these sudden, small, subtle things that answer the questions. Louis Pasteur, the great French physician and inventor of vaccines and germ theory, said, chance favors the prepared mind. You can't always control when you're going to stumble onto an answer, but it's only the prepared mind, the prepared heart, the prepared soul, the prepared spirit that will recognize the answer when they see it or when they encounter it. And that will build your faith, because you'll know that the Lord's watching out for you, knows your concerns, and is helping you bit by bit, grace to grace, here a little and there a little, and suddenly the puzzle clicks into place. That's happened for me many times, and I'm sure it will happen for you if you seek it. I leave you that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Well, thank you, Greg. Appreciate that, and appreciate all of your attendance out there. These tactics are not going to go away. As the work hastens, the adversary is trying to tear this down harder and harder. And so you will all be faced with these types of questions or things that you're asked about. So I hope you just take from tonight anyways, do not take everything at face value. And it was Elder Renlund in our recent YSA face-to-face that we had, where he said, questions are good. He says, the church is here because of the questions of a young boy. It's doubts that we have to watch out for. So don't let doubts creep in. Questions that come, take the time and study them. And I thank Brother Smith so much for his time. We will have a closing prayer by Sister Rebecca Smith from our Victoria Park Ward.